I'm Lorelai. I'm the moderator for today. For today's staying in the game conversation. And joining me is Maria. Everyone knows Maria, the assistant athletic trainer. Ryan, the head men's volleyball coach. Colin, the assistant AD of compliance and athletic communications. And then Brian, the business development manager at Amerex Energy.
Yeah, Brian.
Who is also an EC alum. So everyone gets 5 minutes to talk, at the most 5 minutes. We'll see how long they last. And then after that, it's an open discussion, so you can ask questions and they'll answer. So yeah, we'll start with Maria.
All right, so I'm going to be talking about the effect that heat has on turf and hydration. So in regards to turf versus a grass field, if the temperature is as high as 85 degrees, the average temperature turf field is 117 degrees, compared to a grass field, which is about 78 degrees on average. So it's about a 40-degree difference. Average temperature between August 1st and September 15th ranges between low 80s and high 80s. This past preseason, it was about high 80s. So on turf, it could measure as high as 90, but probably higher than 100 degrees. This is important, obviously, because athletes on turf are at a greater risk of heat illness, requiring additional precautions. All athletes are subject to get heat illness. So the hockey team, you can still get it. Volleyball, it's just a higher likelihood that athletes on turf get it because of the hot, extreme environments outside, mixed with a strenuous activity. So preventative measures that we take as athletic trainers, we have cold plunges outside in a shaded area for rapid cooling. Mandatory water breaks to prevent dehydration, monitoring athletes' well-being throughout the practices, and making sure there's a recovery period between practices. So for preseason, for fall athletes, there's 2-a-day practices. We make sure that they at least have a 4-hour window between the first and second practice to rehydrate and refuel. Sport-specific considerations, really we just tell our fall athletes to adapt to increase temperatures outside. So preseason is deemed that week in August, but technically it really starts 5 to 6 weeks before you get to campus. So when you're acclimating to the heat, you're ready to go when you get to campus. Lastly, the NCAA has a heat policy that we have to follow. So we use a wet bulb, which is this thing. So I go in the middle of the turf before every preseason practice, every game in the fall, and it's basically measuring humidity, radiation, and the air temperature. If it measures above 86 degrees, they have to have mandatory water breaks in practices and games. So yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan. I'm going to be talking about the basics about keeping athletes safe out on the turf field. So number one is hydration. Obviously, water is essential for our body. Its major role is maintaining the body temperature, transporting nutrients throughout the body, and lubricating the joints. Obviously, when we're out on a turf field and we're in the middle of the sun or whatnot, of the heat, dehydration can start occurring. That lack of hydration is going to affect our endurance, our strength, and our coordination. Also, dehydration can lead to heat exhaustion or heat stroke, and then it can also impair our mental focus, making our decision-making a little bit uncertain, our dizziness as well, and kind of feeling those effects. In order to prevent this, obviously, if we're out on the field, prior to getting out to practice or prior to a game, it's essential for you guys to be drinking a lot of water. This is about 30 ounces, so I would say probably 1 or 2 of these before practice, and then during practice, you should probably be finishing, if it's a 2-hour practice, about 2 of these. Afterwards is just as important as drinking water on the field because you're going to be losing all those electrolytes, losing all that sweat, losing all those fluids. So it's just as important to make sure that you're drinking water after a game, especially outdoors, as much as it's during the match. In terms of nutrition, we also have to remember that food is fuel for our body. So it's essential to make sure, even if we're not feeling hungry before practice, especially if we're going outside, it's essential for us to make sure that we're getting in those proteins and everything. A simple meal that you can have before is pairing up a carb with a protein. So if it's an apple with peanut butter or Greek yogurt with a little bit of granola, throw some fruit in there, those type of things. super light. I know for me, when I was an athlete playing, I would never want to have a huge meal before practice or a game, but I needed something in there to make sure that I have energy throughout that practice or match to be able to compete at a high level. And then afterwards, just making sure that we're recovering our body with nutrients that are packed with protein, definitely carbs, some types of healthy fats, whether it's avocados or nuts or anything like that, are just going to help in terms of that recovery process. And then the obvious, but also something that we need to talk about is clothing, apparel, and what we're doing out there. If you're an outdoor sport, 100%, you are not tougher than the sun. You need to put on sunscreen. Some people burn a little bit easier than others. Making sure that you're putting the correct SPF on your body is going to be essential, but also preparing yourselves with the right gear that you're wearing moisture wicking fabrics as well, putting on sunglasses, hats, whatever you kind of need to do to kind of keep yourself out of that light when that sun is kind of beating down on you. And then just any type of small little things that you could do in terms of having a cooling towel or something of that nature is just going to help you kind of stay cool or being in the shade as much as possible. So, all you, sir.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Maria. The approach that I took when we were determining what we wanted to talk about was my approach was a little different. I wanted to study something that was a little more common to you guys and more of a recent activity. So I took the approach of trying to do an analyzation of the turf field that we just got this past summer. Anybody who was here over the summer on our staff was able to see the development of the turf field throughout the process. It was a very lengthy process. Everything from the drainage system to pulling up dirt, moving that dirt off site, leveling the field, having rollers, the excavation equipment, actually rolling the turf itself and the impact of that, the turf and the turf infill. So rubber tire crumbs, sand is one that's a little more of a natural resource, but looking at some of those things to try to determine for a turf field of that size, what might our carbon footprinting be? It's difficult to determine what environmentally safe practices our contractor used for installing the turf field, but for a turf field of that size and data that I was able to pull offline, I can try to give some sort of an estimate as to what our carbon footprinting was. So in terms of production and installation, the first and foremost is the turf manufacturing, right? So the synthetic grass, the backing, the infill material, like the sand and the tire crumbs that I spoke on, the sub-base preparation. So we're excavating out dirt, we're leveling the field, using a stone base, right? Stone was one of the things that was an interesting process. It took a little bit of time, right? And then you're rolling the stone out there to get a flat surface for our athletes. And then another thing that took a bit of time as well was the drainage system, right? So the drainage system that they had to dig underneath the field, run across the street. So hopefully, over time, the turf field becomes better at draining water off the field in the snow, and so on and so forth. And then from the installation side of things, transporting materials and labor-intensive machinery. I saw one of the biggest cranes out there that I've ever seen in my life, right? So moving some of these machines to and from, where's the company coming from? How are we getting the machinery there is an important factor as well. And then in terms of maintenance, turf has a lower maintenance than grass, right? So we're not having to mow the turf. The turf is there. You might need to roll the turf with machinery, but the turf still emits carbon, right? That's one of the interesting things with turf is although there are the carbon emissions happening as we're laying down the turf, the impact of the carbon, it doesn't end when the turf is down, right? It continues to emit over the duration of the life of the turf. So to kind of give you guys some numbers, I'll try not to bore you with this. The dimensions of the field are just under 100,000 square feet outside. On average, turf, the synthetic turf itself, it's emitting about 7 kilograms per square meter out there. When it comes to the infill, so the tire crumbs, the sand, it's about 3 kilograms. So in total, with the materials, we're talking about 90-ish metric tons of carbon, just in that aspect of it. So then when you get to the installation, gravel, excavation, transport of machinery, there's a lot of factors determining where they're coming from. We're looking around that 70 metric ton of transportation, actually doing the physical labor. When it's all said and done, we're talking around 166 metric tons of carbon being emitted for a project like a turf field. Okay. The equivalency would be driving a average mile per gallon car around the circumference of the earth about 17 times for a project of that magnitude. Okay. So in finish here, having a turf, there are positive benefits, eliminates gasoline use from machinery like mowing, eliminates pesticide use, fertilizers that they would need to put on the grass to keep it healthy, water conservation. We're not using irrigation systems anymore. And then we're using recycled material, tire crumbs, infill, so on and so forth. And there's lower maintenance on the back end.
Good morning, everyone, or is it afternoon yet? Maybe not. Okay. Well, I'm Brian Waymire. I'm with Amerex Energy Services. Just wanted to thank you for having me here. It's been about 10 years since I've been on campus, so I'm very excited to be back here. But yeah, as I mentioned, I graduated in 2016. I was a part of the first ever baseball program at the college. So I'm very proud of that and building something bigger for the college. And my goal with this is to bridge what I do for work and bring it full circle in what sustainability solutions are out there and bring it to the sports world, because we're all are impacted by climate change to some degree. But as I said, I work for Amerex Energy Services. We're a small company inside the large organization of BGC, Cantor Fitzgerald, headquartered in New York City. It was one of the corporations that was impacted by the 9/11 attacks in the World Trade Center. And our former CEO, Howard Lutnick, has just been confirmed as Secretary of Commerce for the United States. But what we really do for Amerex is we're national energy consultants. So we work with clients on natural gas procurement, energy procurement, and renewable energy solutions to mitigate scope 2 emissions, which I'll get into a little later. But we work with many different large organizations, colleges, corporates. Wegmans is one that you may have heard of. PetSmart, Marriott, some universities like Baylor and Carnegie Mellon University. But climate change has caused a lot of these larger organizations to make a stand towards their carbon footprint and commit to very aggressive sustainability goals. Some you may see advertisements even on TV that's saying, hey, I'm so-and-so company, I'm committed to carbon neutrality by 2050. And what I do is focus on the business side of that, is helping those organizations find ways to mitigate their carbon footprint. And we do so in several different ways. I can discuss later on the details of these, but a lot of the technical terms might go over your head. But we do this through REC purchases, renewable energy certificates, community solar projects, on-site solar projects, energy efficiency programs, virtual power purchase agreements, and power purchase agreements. So really the goal is to, if you produce a lot of carbon dioxide, you want to either mitigate that or eliminate it as an organization. Just a couple quick facts from, I found this on nasa.gov, that global temperatures are rising about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 19th century, and this is largely driven by carbon dioxide emissions into the atmosphere. Most of this warming has occurred just in the past 40 years, and we've had some of the warmest years on record between 2016 and 2020. So it's why it's so important to discuss these heat impacts and what they have on athletes and what organizations they can do to slow the temperature increase. So you may ask, how is this even done? Where do I start? What do I do? From a business standpoint, you have to measure what your carbon footprint is, what your carbon output is. And it's done so in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. And basically scope 1 is meaning the emissions that you physically produce. So a good example of that is the turf field, the gasoline that was used in the lawnmowers to mow the grass before it was installed. That would be a direct scope 1 emissions calculation. So scope 2 would be all of your purchase energy, which is what myself and my organization's focus is on primarily. Is scope 2 is your purchase electricity. So where you're getting that electricity from. Are you getting it from a wind farm or a solar farm? Or is it coming from just gas and boilers? So that's where my organization focuses on, is that scope 2 mitigation part. Scope 3 mitigation is your whole supply chain. So the supplier that's used to install the turf field at the college, they would have to meet a bunch of sustainability targets. The food that is used to fuel athletes, the food you get from the CC, that all has to be sustainable in terms of scope 3 mitigation. But really, what I can go into details on on a lot of that, but I'll try not to bore you. But like I said, climate change has impacts everywhere, especially with athletic organizations as well. I don't know if you guys ever heard of Front Office Sports, but I recommend to follow that on, I don't know if they're using LinkedIn or if that's just like an old person thing now. I don't know. But LinkedIn, or they're probably on Instagram too. But basically, it links the business side of things to the sports world. And they came up with a 2024 most sustainable athletic organizations. So some of what these organizations are doing, USB Arena, that's in Elmont, New York, that's where the Islanders play. Some things that they do is they focus on energy efficient lighting throughout the whole stadium to help mitigate their scope 2 emissions. They achieved actually carbon neutrality for scope 1 and 2 emissions a year ahead of schedule. And a lot of that has contributed to renewable energy sourcing. Another notable one is Portland, Oregon, Moda Center, where the Trailblazers play. Another exciting thing is that they're focusing on energy efficiency within their building with lighting. That's one of the easiest ways to achieve sustainability is through efficiency, because the kilowatt hour that you don't use is the most efficient. But yeah, a lot of these sports organizations are impacted through climate change and are making great steps towards doing the right thing for their community and their organization.
Thank you all. That was great. Thank you for putting in the time and effort for researching it and applying it to sports. Now that they've finished with their presentation, it's time for questions and conversation. So if you have any questions, please let me know and I'll give you the mic.
Quiet crowd.
So we obviously do cold plunges, we do ice towels on the sidelines. We do a taco method, if you will. So if someone's doing or experiencing heat illness, we'll wrap them up in a little tarp essentially, and you have ice and water in there to cool down their core temperatures. There's new things coming out, like a cooling vest that they use. We don't have that obviously, but that's coming out. And there's also handheld cooling devices, because a way to cool down your core temperature is through your hands, like putting ice in your hands and your feet. So, yeah.
Great questions.
Yeah, so there's a lot of tracking systems that companies use. Their greenhouse gas emissions reporting platform. Um, there's also science-based target initiatives. That's like a global kind of accounting and tracking system that these organizations use to figure out what their carbon footprint is. But yeah, like I said, that's the first step, is really tracking what it is and then finding the solutions to help mitigate.
So you talked about what you should do while in practice and after with like water and what you should wear. Do you think that schools or institutions should be held reliable when it comes to those sort of heat-related injuries or illnesses? Like, should they have to provide clothing and sunscreen and water?
I think if you're an outdoor sport, I think it's part of like everyone working together, from the coaches, from the athletic training staff, to make sure that you're putting your athletes in a good position. So like if I'm an outdoor sport, like I'm probably going to stay away from all black gear. You know what I mean? I'll go to white gear or something that's a little bit more bright. And then same thing, I think how dedicated Maria and Dave are here at Elmira College. Like they're the ones that are, this is part of their job, like kind of like the routines as an athlete were, to make sure that they're putting on their shoes, getting all their gear on. Just Maria goes out there, like she mentioned, checks the field every single day. So I think as long as everyone is putting the athlete's safety at best interest, I think that's the benefit for everybody. So. Any questions for Colin?
So, Therese, do you know if the school do that ahead of time? And now that you know that, is that potentially something the school will look at for new builds?
I can't speak to whether the school knew of that or not. I mean, I don't know exactly where, and Brian might know, but like where that ranks in terms of like how large that scope actually is, compared to other projects, right? I think of a field like Morrisville. They just installed new turf. Their turf is black, right? So what effect might that have, in terms of the carbon footprint or the effect on the athletes? I do think that it's something that's important for everybody to keep in the forefront of their mind. I wouldn't say that this is something that I study on a regular basis, but I think kind of doing some research on this opened my eyes a little bit, in terms of like we see things happen out there, or I was out there every day throughout the summer watching the process of how it evolved, and you don't really think twice about it, right? You kind of just say, "Oh, wow, they're moving dirt today." There's machinery running, which when that's happening, we're all clapping our hands like, "All right, we're moving closer towards our goal." But what are the, impacts that might have? So it's something that every organization should keep in the forefront of their mind and consider when contracting out or choosing bids between companies for turf field installations, or building management and production. So yeah, it's definitely something I don't have a ton of knowledge on, but was able to kind of get a better glimpse here, and think that it's important for every organization to be on top of that and research that before choosing.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I think definitely it is a considering factor. Again, can't speak to the college specifically if it's a considering factor, but a lot of organizations are considering their carbon footprint when they install new buildings on their campuses, or they're adding new fleets. A lot of UC companies, instead of using gas powered cars for their fleets for their employees for travel, they're switching to EV cars. So I would say it's strongly a considering factor, especially if the CEO or the owner of the company has a specific mandate to achieve carbon neutrality by a certain goal.
Yeah, and also like to everything, there's trade-offs, right? So you do one thing, there's going to be an adverse reaction, right? So we add turf, we eliminate pesticides, we eliminate mowing the grass, the machinery out there to maintain the field. So there's always going to be a trade-off in whatever we do, whatever production we're building. There's a purpose and there's a benefit to one group of people, and there's an adverse to that where another group of people are more affected from that. So I think that's important in any term of life, is understanding that there's a trade-off to every decision that we make.
And then the even harder problem to this all is, what is the cost? So a lot of organizations want to do the right thing and be sustainable, but it's finding a way to make it affordable. And that's part of my role in what I do for organizations. Is it's hard just to say, hey, I want 100% renewable electricity for my organization. Let me just go out and do it. There's a lot of money that's attached to that. So it's getting creative and finding ways through energy efficiencies, or maybe it's installing a rooftop solar, but yeah, finding the way to make there be less trade-offs, or to make it make sense.
Yep.
So what trade-offs and like natural versus field up front to build a turf field, like you said, there's a big carbon impact, but over time, do you think like that pays off and it's worth it compared to a natural surface?
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's hard to say without seeing like the actual details. But obviously there's a lot of environmental benefits of not using a lawnmower, not having to water the grass, not using pesticides to treat the grass. There's a lot of benefits that can outweigh some of the other half of it. But yeah, it is hard to say, and that's some of the biggest challenges that I run into is when we do meet with organizations, is the patience and letting it all play out. In the future, a lot of times it will pay off. But it's hard to say exactly that is the correct answer.
Yeah, I would agree. It's tough to know when we'll be carbon neutral. Just not having the exact figures, but that's where I, speak on the trade-offs, right? So, what is the trade-off to having the turf field? Well, we have lights, right? And that's something I didn't even consider. I didn't work into my equations here of determining what the emissions were, but we have lights. What opportunity does that afford our athletes having lights in the campus population? What effect does it have on intramurals, right? Providing opportunity is really the main trade-off, I'd say, to turf versus grass fields across the country, especially in the Northeast. But without having exact figures, it's difficult to determine when carbon neutrality would occur on that.
Well, thank you all for coming. That ends our discussion here. Again, if you're here for class and you didn't get to sign